Now we'll look at an interesting application of priority queues that's actually representative of a whole family of critically important applications in applications of computing. It's called event-driven simulation. And the idea is we want to study some property of the natural world by simulating it. And that's something that's very, very common in scientific inquiry nowadays. And this is a very natural idea. And actually the idea goes back to Einstein. So we want to simulate the motion of n moving particles that might collide. With a priority, this kind of simulation is enabled by priority queues. Without something like priority queues, you couldn't do this for a large number of particles because it would require quadratic time and simply can't be afforded for a huge number of particles. So let's take a look at how we can possibly make this happen. We use a simple scientific model called the hard disk model, and then this is just for simplicity to get this done in just part of a lecture. Clearly, these things can be extended in many ways. So we're going to have moving particles that either collide with each other and with the walls, and each particle is a disk that's got known position, velocity, mass, and radius. And there's no other forces involved. It gets more complicated if there's more forces, like gravity involved. This one by itself is very significant. As I mentioned, goes back to study of physics with trying to understand pressure and temperature and Einstein's famous experiment on pollen grains showing that their motion was Brownian or random. So whether it's individual atoms and molecules or it's some bigger kinds of particles, it's a complex dynamic situation that is better understood through computer simulation. And nowadays, that means priority queues. So as a warm-up, here's the code to implement bouncing balls without the collisions. This is an elementary programming exercise that is the code at the left has the effect shown at the right. So we have a data type called ball that represents just one of the particles and has instance variables that has the position and the velocity. So we make a bunch of them, and then we have a while loop, which is just every 50 milliseconds, clear the whole drawing, and then move the balls a little bit, and then draw them in their current position. And the only thing the move operation does is to update the position of the ball by the velocity, which is just another number, and then it does the bouncing off the walls. If it happens to hit the left wall, you reflect the x-coordinate, and the right wall, you reflect the x-coordinate, and bottom and top, you do the same for the y-coordinates. So this is an easy programming exercise given the right display primitives. And it's a good exercise in object-oriented programming showing how just one implementation, then we can use that same implementation to simulate a number of instances. So that's our starting point in terms of the code. This is the implementation of the ball class. So it's got position and velocity, as I mentioned, and every ball has a radius. And then there's a constructor, and maybe we have a constructor that takes arguments that would initialize the position and the velocity, or maybe initialize them to a random position if there's no arguments. And then here's the move method. And the move method, again, most of the times just takes the x and y coordinates and adds the current velocity times the speed constant, dt, or speed variable that's given as argument dt. And then these tests are for whether it hits the walls, in which case you have to flip the x or y velocity. And then draw is just using standard draw, just draw the ball. So that's all the code for doing the bouncing ball simulation. Now, what's missing in this is what happens when the balls collide with each other. And to cope with that, we need to do both a little bit of high school physics and a little bit of basic computer science. So the physics problem is exactly what happens when two balls hit. They bounce off each other according to some well understood physical process, and that's the high school physics. And the CS problem is how and when do we exactly do these computations for each of the balls, and how can we do it efficiently, that is in n log n time versus quadratic time. Because if we have a computational process that takes quadratic time, then it's not going to scale. We're not going to be able to do large numbers of particles. Simulations of the real world, usually we wind up doing huge amounts of data, and we cannot have a quadratic algorithm. And this is just a first indication of that, of why if you want to do this simulation, you better know about some data structure like priority queues. If you try to do it without it, you're not going to be successful. All right, so let's take a look at what happens. There's a number of things that you might consider trying. One idea is a so-called time-driven simulation. And we just say we're going to update everything every dt seconds. And then we go ahead and do that, and then we could check if there's a collision, if the two balls, some pieces of two balls are occupying the same space. And if there is, then we could roll back time just a little bit and try to figure out exactly the moment at which they collided, and then figure out how their position of velocity should change accordingly, and then continue the simulation. But this has a huge problem. The first one is that you have to check all pairs of balls for overlap. So that's quadratic. So it's going to be really a lot of overall checks. You're not going to be able to do it for a huge value of n. But the other thing is, even if n is small, if you do a very small dt, then you're just doing this calculation over and over again, and there's just too much computation, moving the balls a little bit at a time. On the other hand, if you try and improve things by making dt too large, you might completely miss a collision, as shown in the example at right. So figuring out the value of dt that would really work is a huge problem for the time-driven simulation. Instead, what we want to do is called an event-driven simulation. And this is a very general concept that's useful in all kinds of contexts. And we're only going to change things when something happens. So since the only thing that matters is collisions, we're going to figure that particles move in a straight line between collisions. And what we're going to do is focus only on the times when the collisions are going to occur. And so the way we're going to do that is to maintain a priority queue. And that priority queue is going to have all the possible collisions that could happen in the future, and they're going to be prioritized by time. And when we remove the minimum element from the priority queue, that's the next collision that we have to deal with. And so we have two phases. We have predict